Hi everyone, it's Raina. So I'm going to be doing a two-part series on addiction and astrology and how each sign may gravitate towards a certain drug of choice. And when I use the word drug, I am including alcohol. I probably will keep saying alcohol because, people who have addictive tendencies, they'll just glom onto every word and say, "Oh, well, she's talking about drugs. I'm not a drug addict. I'm somebody who drinks, 5 times a week, so I'm not who she's talking about." And that brings up another point. And when we talk about addiction, people think, "Oh, you have to be doing it all the time to be addicted." Really, a better word is compulsive behavior around, or you could say substance abuse. That's probably the best way of putting it because, then we don't just use the word like drug, but substances. And it's important to note that it's not just about mind altering chemicals that people can become addicted to or they can be compulsive about. It can be sex, food, the internet, and other kinds of, like TV and movies, the escapism in that sense. And I'm also going to talk about why people engage in substance abuse. Is it because they are just into a certain feeling that they get from a certain drug, or is it that they're trying to drown their sorrows? What is going on? Well, it's more than one thing. Some people have one reason, some people have another reason. So I'm going to be talking about motivations. And in this first video, I'm going to talk about the houses that I feel are connected to addiction, and we can say overindulgence as well. Not just like straight addiction, because the thing about it is that even if somebody doesn't use a particular substance 7 days a week, it can still have adverse consequences for their life. And you also have to say to yourself, like, why do you need to alter your consciousness chemically 5 days a week, 3 days a week? Like, why do you need to do it? And one thing that people assume is that, well, other people are doing it, so this is just normal behavior. First of all, not everyone gets drunk every week. Not everyone smokes weed and gets high every week or every day. There are people who are completely sober and they don't use anything. Oh yeah, that's another thing too, because I'm not talking about everything. Like, I'm not going to bring up caffeine. So some people may think that that's hypocritical of me. The reason I'm not bringing up something like caffeine is because I'm really talking about it having an intoxicating effect on the person. Yes, there is going to be some kind of change in the person when they consume a cup of coffee within their body, but you don't necessarily know if somebody has ingested caffeine. Whereas even if somebody has only had a couple of drinks and they're quote unquote tipsy, you can usually tell right away that they're like in an altered state of consciousness. So I want to focus on that kind of usage and not just things that we think of as technically drugs like caffeine. And then in the second video that I do, I will talk about the different signs and what they tend to gravitate towards and why. But I'm not going to be covering these other types of addictive behaviors. This is really about substance abuse, okay? So the three houses that I'm going to focus on where you may have planetary placements are, oh no, did I say three? I think I'm going to say four. I'm going to include the first house. That was the one that I left out before. The first house, the fifth house, the eighth house, and the 12th houses. Briefly, I will explain why according to each house. The first house is the house of the self. Let's say somebody has Chiron in the first house and they always have felt bad about themselves. They always have had low self-esteem. There's something about themselves at a core level that they feel is unacceptable because they may have actually experienced rejection about whatever this thing is. And so in their mind, they have proof that it's not acceptable. When people feel this way, they're compelled to maybe mask their feelings. And also, the first house can be how you behave around other people. If you have a sign like Cancer, Pisces, I'm trying to think of some other signs, maybe Virgo, you may be very kind of timid and some people use, for instance, alcohol to loosen up. Now, this may not be something that you do every day again. This may be situational, where you're doing it in certain circumstances to be able to feel more confident. The fourth house of home and family is also the house of childhood. So it's a house of the past. Sometimes people have very painful pasts. I'll talk about certain planets, like if you have Mars in the fourth, Pluto in the fourth, Chiron in the fourth house. These are examples. Saturn in the fourth. Even Uranus in the fourth, for instance, if you had an unstable home, these can leave a lot of unhappy, painful memories of certain things that happened long ago that you're trying to forget. The fourth house can be the mother. Some people say the father. So we'll just say the family of origin, your roots, and something painful within that. But because childhood is idealized, if you had a less than idyllic childhood, it could be something that you are that bothers you as an adult. If you are a Cancer, if you're a Capricorn, there are certain signs that really kind of or also if you had, when I say if you had an unhappy childhood, also if you had like a broken family, some kind of alienation from your family, and it might not be on your end of things where you had a parent abandon the family or just stop talking to you. Maybe they created a new family and they left the old one in the dust. There are all those possibilities. You could be a person that it really bothers that this happened. Whereas another sign might be like, oh, well, that sucked. But they're very independent and they don't really, they just move on with their life. So, yeah, so if you have some of those planets, Mercury in the fourth, where you're always thinking about the past, the moon in the fourth, always being tied to the past that way, that could play out. In the fifth house, oh wow, I just realized I hope I said the fifth house, and I don't think I did. So it's actually 5 houses. The fifth house is a house of pleasure. And that's certainly one of the motivations of people who use or abuse substances, is that they're looking for that pleasure principle. the sensations that it provides are things that they're seeking, they're chasing. But also the fifth house is the house of love. So if someone has Chiron here, Neptune here, maybe you have had painful experiences with love, disillusioning experiences. This could cause you to feel a bit jaded, but also in some cases you may be yearning to experience love. And depending on other factors in your life, if you were deprived in proper nurturing, you may put too much importance on relationships. And by the way, the fifth house is not the house of relationships. That's the seventh house. But the fifth house is the bridge to that seventh house because it's the house of love. So, one produces the other. So, in that context, a person who is trying to find the love of their life may be frustrated. Sometimes people are too, they're not discerning enough when it comes to who they get involved with, and then they end up experiencing something that is not quite suitable for themselves when it comes to love and whatnot. They might experience a relationship, a potential partner a series of people who are just not relationship worthy. They're just interested in a good time. And this is where the person may get involved intimately too early in the relationship. And sometimes because this is the house of recreational sex too. So, and of course that's because pleasure is connected to this house. It's also the house of conceiving children. So it kind of irks me that that's the case because, those two things are exact opposites from one another, or they should be. People should be very conscious when they're trying to conceive, or when they are conceiving, rather than, oh, I guess I'm pregnant, or I guess I got somebody pregnant. But it is what it is. And so the fifth house can be pleasure seeking, but also that emptiness if the person doesn't have love and they are looking for something to make themselves feel like fill them up, so to speak. The eighth house is Scorpio's domain, and it is the house of death and rebirth, and it's also the house of transformation, and it's the house of the shadow self. So sometimes people feel these uncomfortable feelings when it comes to their uncomfortable feelings. So I'll give an example. A Libra person who believes that his or her job is to be nice, to be gracious, can experience difficult emotions like anyone else, and yet they could feel like it's wrong for them to feel that way. And this can be even like with recurring relationships with family members. Maybe they have a hard time saying no. They have a hard time asking for what they need, or even saying how they feel, being truthful about it, because they're so concerned with being rejected or how other people will perceive them. That can put a lot of pressure on someone, and they can look for an escape because of that. So that's one thing. But in any kind of trauma, if you have planets in the eighth house, you may be very well versed in trauma, Like if you have the sun here or Mars, I mean, I would say the sun is more, I have the sun in the eighth house, for instance. And it doesn't mean that the person hasn't experienced trauma, but it's almost like it becomes their life path to some degree, is like being able to be that phoenix rising from the ashes and reinvent themselves maybe multiple times throughout their life. But if someone has Neptune here, Neptune can be drugs. And the eighth house can be, the person may flirt with death. Jim Morrison and his partner, Pamela Corson, both had Neptune in the eighth house and both died, supposedly, I guess we could say, due to drugs. And, whether somebody intentionally takes an overdose or accidentally does so, it's really like a fine line, because even if they accidentally overdose, there still is this, if it's like a hard drug like heroin, that's a very dangerous drug. Or when I say heroin, I'm talking about opiates. It could be fentanyl and things like that. Those are very powerful drugs, or very addictive drugs, physically addictive drugs, and they have the potential to instantly kill someone. And although I have heard that heroin, well, I shouldn't say it because I might be wrong about that, and I don't want to make heroin out to be like, safe, which it is not. But I'm just saying that fentanyl is supposed to be even more powerful than heroin, but they're in the same group, they're in the same family. So the point is that this idea of death can be very intriguing to people who are troubled, but those same people can be very spiritual or very psychic. And this is one of the reasons why they suffer in life, because they have a lot of intuitive gifts that the world doesn't really honor or have an understanding about. So it's almost like a daredevil thing. And certainly Jim Morrison specifically was somebody, who would go and walk on a balcony, walk on a ledge outside of a window that was, floors above the street level, like way up there. And he was already inebriated. So that kind of behavior is like really reckless. But I'm not talking about that now. I'm talking about the type of drugs that people use. And in the eighth house, it can be things that maybe pierce the veil of death. So yeah, I mean, there are drugs like ayahuasca that are plant medicines that are psychedelics, but they are used for shadow work, for uncovering trauma. But the reason that I'm not going to really dwell on those drugs is I don't think that it's easy to abuse ayahuasca. I could be totally wrong about that, but I don't see that as a recreational drug. Psychedelics can be abused, though, in general. Marijuana is considered a mild psychedelic, but even, people can use mushrooms or peyote indiscriminately. Acid, all of those things. And they can have consequences. They may not be physically addictive, but they might be psychologically addictive. And it could, threaten relationships where the other person feels shut out or alienated from that person's relationship. So, yeah, so the eighth house to me is about the uncomfortable emotions, the desire to kind of like transform oneself. So the person wants to change from one consciousness to another. But I think mostly it could be even, it's a water house because it is ruled by Scorpio. So it might be that the person is trying to suppress the trauma more than anything. And the 12th house is the house of, Pisces. And that is a straight up house of escapism. Pisces is ruled by Neptune. Neptune can deal in fantasy and escapism. A person who is very sensitive may feel like the world is so cruel. And so if you have planets in the 12th house, like the moon is a perfect example, because a person can feel sorry for themselves. They can feel like they are a victim in life, that they are not understood emotionally. They've never been understood emotionally. There's so many possibilities. There's a sense of isolation with the 12th house. So again, with the moon, the emotional nature, the person may always feel lonely. And they don't realize that it isn't because they are just being punished or whatever. I mean, the 12th house is the house of karma. So there might be some karmic connection to their circumstance that made it so that they would have those planets there. But they do have the possibility of not being isolated. It's that they personally feel that urge to be alone. And it's almost like it's a house of self-undoing. So the person might do things that really trip them up. They might be self-destructive, and drugs can certainly be self-destructive. And why do people want to do self-destructive things? Well, I think a fair number of them have probably been abused in their life. And when that abuse ends, they take over from their abuser and they start beating up on themselves. And sometimes that can be because of their drug of choice. Or again, they feel isolated from others and want to merge with the cosmos. The 12th house can be spiritual stage of consciousness. God, so ultimately there might be this desire to kind of merge with the universe or with God. That might take the form of psychedelics, but I could see it happening with the opiates as well, because they're putting themselves into this state that is like where they have no thoughts, where they're kind of like, you would think it would be this exalted state, but because it's drug induced, it's not. Obviously, it's not going to be that way. Before I continue, I think it goes without saying, but I have no degrees, training in mental health, in drug counseling, and any of that stuff. So anything that I say, it's coming from my own opinions and is not meant to be, the ultimate truth. Also, I know that there are people out there who believe that certain substances like psychedelics can help them to gain insights into their true nature. And some people even use them for mental health therapies. I think there might be like some therapists and that are trained to use those kinds of things, like mushrooms is an example that I've seen, to help their patients. And I'm not here to talk about that. I personally believe that we don't need anything ultimately. And I think that, if somebody tells you that something is such a great way to cure something, that, you should definitely do your research and see what the downsides are. Anybody that presents a completely rosy picture about things, if they're selling something, then you know why they're doing it. But other people do it just because they had a good experience. We're not all the same. And you can't even say with those people if it's going to be a permanent change in their life, or if it was kind of like this temporary thing that jolted them out of that frame of mind that they were in and they went to a different place. So I'm not saying that, these plant medicines or what have you can't be helpful on any level, but I just ask people to research it because I don't think one size fits all. And I was looking at a spiritual channel that was talking about plant medicines, I think ayahuasca in particular, and how when they're dealing with their clients who've gone to these plant ceremonies, they have to pull off these entities off these people because they open themselves up to this other, to these, energetic attachments. Because that's just what happens when you alter your consciousness, that you can open gateways for that kind of hijacking or whatever you want to call it. And this is something that, and also just even like somebody's psychological state, they might not be attuned to it. They may have anxiety. It's not, to me, it's very reckless to just do things without thinking about it. And I'm not going to get into people who, because in the second video, I'm going to talk about the different, I'm not going to do the different signs. I'm going to do the different elements. So I'm going to do the fire signs. What do they gravitate towards? The air, etc. Some of these drugs are prescription drugs that are abused, that are taken recreationally. So it's not to get into a whole debate about should people be taking Xanax if they have anxiety, because I'm very opinionated about that, but I don't want to confuse it with what we're talking about here, which is what people are gravitating to based on their sign. And in this video, looking at the different houses and the motivations. So in the first house of the self, I already gave the example of Chiron. And this is this can make somebody very like super sensitive when it comes to their own sense of self. Neptune here can give confusion, can mean that the person doesn't know who they are, and is also very impressionable, meaning that they are very easily influenced by the environment in which they find themselves in. And how that can manifest in a challenging way is when someone hangs around people who are using substances. You know how the parents would say hanging out with a bad crowd. But even in one's family of origin, if somebody has Neptune in their first house, they may, or in the fourth house, they may grow up with addiction in their immediate environment. But with confusion of self, the person may use substances in order to be what they think they should be. Like, in other words, if a woman isn't sure if she's beautiful and she takes a drug like cocaine or something like that, which, and that, by the way, that can also be like body dysmorphia. I have a video on that for people who have body dysmorphia and eating addictions, disorders. I was saying eating addictions, and I was thinking that doesn't sound right. Eating disorders and a distortion of how one looks. And so drugs, sometimes people, because the first house can be the body, so sometimes people abuse drugs because they're trying to achieve this perfect body. So they might take stimulants to cut their appetites, for instance. And of course, that's very dangerous because it can create not only the addiction itself, but the nutritional deficiency that could result as well. So there can be a lot going on with that. And then when you think about a person who's insecure, maybe shy or what have you, they can use this type of, these uppers, as they call them, to give like false confidence. Even alcohol has been called liquid courage, and sometimes people take, like, they call it fortifying themselves, before they go to a social event. They have a few so that they can seem like they're really confident and that they're not going to be like withdrawn. And I mean, it goes without saying that these kinds of behaviors, to me, even if the person doesn't do this like every day or every other day, just it's a form of abuse because they're using it for the wrong reasons. But how can you, cocaine is something, or, meth, these are not things that we think of using in a very, orderly kind of way. They are always seen as like, oh my gosh, this person's doing it. Alcohol has a different, reputation, so it's more socially acceptable. But there are prescription drugs with things like Ritalin and Adderall, and these types of uppers or speed are used recreationally. So it just goes to show that this is, just because it's being prescribed doesn't mean that, by a doctor, doesn't mean it can't be used recreationally. And, so the first house, I think, because it's ruled by Aries, and it has that kind of, Aries has that reputation for having endless energy. It's attached to the physical, that the person may use something to enhance their physical abilities. Now, if we were talking about things that are not necessarily mind altering, we could even say steroids with the first house, because it could be the bodybuilder who is using these like performance enhancing drugs like steroids to kind of, better living through chemistry, taking those drugs to build up their body instead of doing it the old fashioned way. And yes, steroids definitely have some side effects. and I have seen it myself. I saw a guy that I could tell his head was like 2 sizes too big for his body. It was scary. It makes your head, you know, balloon. And then he looked like he was about to lose it. You know what I mean? You know, when they have roid rage and stuff like that. He just looked like he was going crazy or something. So anyway, the other thing too is if you have the moon in the first house, you may feel especially vulnerable. And, you know, let's say the moon is in a water sign, like not necessarily Scorpio, because Scorpio can be like a poker face kind of a sign, where Scorpio people or Scorpio rising people are very secretive about what they're really feeling, and they may kind of give a nondescript outer appearance, but really beneath the surface, they're either seething or just like in this very intense emotional state. So, but you know, a sign like Cancer doesn't tend to shy away from being emotional, and then also Pisces. So in those instances, you might have someone who is feeling kind of like vulnerable to the point where they feel like it could work against them in some way, like other people could take advantage of them. And so maybe they take something that makes them feel not so emotional. Now that could be anything. The water signs tend to favor depressants or downers, like alcohol is one, which it numbs you and numbs your emotions. Alcohol, Xanax, and I mean the hardcore would be the opiates, like heroin, fentanyl, and I guess just opium itself. So, I think that's all I wanted to say about the first house. But also, just in general, just this idea, the self concept. If the person's self concept is crap, they may try to escape. You know, they're like, I don't want to be who I am. So I'm going to I'm going to just lose myself in some other state of consciousness. And then I don't have to be myself right now. So in the fourth house of home and family, like I said, there could be this tie to childhood. Because this is a water house and this is the house that is ruled by Cancer, I feel like depressants may be something that the person takes so that they don't feel the pain that is associated with the past. So somebody may be like, I can't stop thinking about this trauma that I experienced when I was younger. I can't stop thinking about the fact that my mother died when I was young, or my father died, and that really was traumatic, or that you know, I was sexually abused when I was young. I was sent away to relatives because my grandmother raised me and my mom was on drugs. You know, if you have Neptune in the fourth house, you may, just like what I've said about the first house, but the fourth house too can really be this situation where addiction is part of your childhood. And this can lead to somebody who feels very, you might feel very anti-drugs, anti-alcohol because of growing up like that. Sometimes because Neptune can be confusion, chaos, and you may have to raise yourself. And this can also, I should have said that with Neptune in the first house. And so it can feel like abandonment, and it is abandonment. Neglect, even if it's not done maliciously, is a form of abandonment and by extension abuse, although I don't like to use the word abuse because it um, implies that the parent is doing something intentionally, and that's not the case. What can happen ultimately, maybe as the person matures, is that they realize that they have to make peace with the past. This is what happens when people, and that's kind of the scary thing about self-medicating, because you can lose yourself and then you forget why you did it in the first place. And so being able to integrate the past is something that takes place when a person is healing, where you're not rejecting what happened. You make peace with it because you know that what happened for a reason, and that it doesn't reflect badly on you. It doesn't mean that you did something wrong or that you weren't good enough. Other heavy planets to look at are Saturn and Pluto in this fourth house. And or Pluto in this fourth house. Saturn can be an authoritarian presence where it doesn't feel like, you can have that relaxed feeling and the safe feeling of being at home. There's always these rules that you have to follow. Obviously there are rules, but it just is excessive. And an austerity, a coldness in the environment. Pluto can be this intensity. Maybe there's things below the surface, this control, this smothering behavior. The mother that I associate with the fourth house, she can be like overbearing, almost like she doesn't want you to have your own self, like you're a part of her. So some of these can indicate narcissism as well, maybe tyranny, in the home, and same with Mars. And sometimes it can be domestic violence because Mars can be that kind of violence, but conflict. Pluto can also indicate that. So those can be the things that you don't want to remember. And we can't run away from these things. We have to bravely face them. However it is that you can get to healing that. But trying to numb the pain isn't the answer. It makes sense why people would want to, because it can be overwhelming to and to feel like it's kind of like this albatross that you're just kind of dragging around. You can't shake. And sometimes if people have, like I said, the moon, Mercury, something that makes them keep getting triggered from the past, that can feel very oppressive and hard to kind of transcend. I think I'm going to break this up in this first exploration into the houses. I'm going to make it into 2 videos because I'm already over 43 minutes. And I just don't want to do like an hour and a half video. I don't know how many people would sit through that. So, okay, wait for part 2. It's coming pretty soon.